"The alien queen saw my wounds. Who did this to you, human?" she said. "They will be punished." The ship smelled like a bad decision. That was always Rourke's first thought when he climbed into the pilot cradle of the Stories. And he'd climbed into it approximately 4,000 times across 19 years of hauling cargo between orbital stations, moon platforms, and the handful of surviving surface depots that still had atmosphere thick enough to bother with a pressurized dock. The ship smelled like coolant that had been burning slowly for a decade, like the particular staleness of recycled air that had passed through two men's lungs more times than the scrubbers were designed to handle, like the ghost of every bad meal cooked in a microwave that had stopped rotating in year 3, and that neither he nor Doyle had ever replaced. He loved the smell. He would not have admitted this to anyone. "You're doing it again," said Doyle, without looking up from the navigation console. "I'm sitting down," Rourke said. "You're sitting down the way you sit down when you're thinking about whether to take the job. You breathe through your nose 3 times. Rourke had, in fact, breathed through his nose 3 times. "It's a tell," he admitted. "It's been a tell for 11 years. I've been waiting for you to notice." Doyle tapped something on the console, and the Stories approach vector to Lunar Station Driscoll resolved on the main screen, a slow arc curving down toward the gray-brown bulk of the moon, toward the cluster of hab rings and docking gantries that made up the station. From up here it looked small. Everything looked small from up here. That was the thing nobody told you about space, Rourke had come to understand. It didn't make you feel large or significant. It just made you feel exactly the size you were, no more, no less, which was usually not as large as you'd hoped. "The job is good money," he said. "The job is absurd money," Doyle said. "Which is the problem with it? We need the retirement. We need a retirement that doesn't involve being arrested or decomposed." Rourke said nothing. The retirement fund for third-generation clone workers on a standard Helix Corporation contract was, to use the technical actuarial term, a joke. Not a good joke. The kind of joke that only became funny years later if you survived to find it funny, which many third-gens did not. He and Doyle were both 41, which in third-gen biology was the beginning of the part of the manual nobody read aloud. The section about joint calcification and circulatory degradation, and the cognitive fog that the Helix medical team called generational drift, and that Rourke called forgetting things he'd never known in the first place. They were the end of a line. Third-generation clones from the same Irish heritage batch. Helix had a thing about naming their agricultural and transport workers after old Celtic traditions, which some mid-level executive had apparently decided gave the program character. Rourke and Doyle had both been grown in the same facility outside of Cologne, had been assigned to each other as a cargo team at activation, had spent 19 years in the same ship, and had between them approximately nothing to show for it except the Stories herself, which was not even officially theirs. Least to own, 12 years left on the contract, and the math on whether they'd live to make the last payment was not math either of them ran anymore. So yes, the money was a consideration. Lunar Station Driscoll Docking Control gave them Bay 17, which was the bay they always got because it was the smallest one, and the Stories was not a large ship. The gantry clamps engaged on the second try. This was an improvement. Rourke unfolded himself from the pilot cradle. His left knee made the sound it always made, a dry grind that the station medic had called not urgent for 3 years, and went to meet the woman who had chartered them. Her name was Voss. She was not from Helix. She was from something called the Consolidated Interplanetary Development Authority, which Rourke had never heard of but which had, Doyle had established, a legal registration, a physical address, and enough credit to offer them a payment that was 10 times their standard rate for what was described in the contract as a standard cargo transfer from Driscoll to Earth Orbital Platform 14. Standard cargo transfers did not pay 10 times standard rate. Voss was tall, with close-cropped gray hair and the specific stillness of someone who had spent a long career learning not to show what they were thinking. She had a tablet in one hand and a case in the other, the case about the size of a large briefcase, matte black, no markings, handled with the careful neutrality of something she was trained not to draw attention to. She shook Rourke's hand once firmly, then Doyle's, then said, "Cargo is crate 9 Delta, already loaded to your hold. We leave in 3 hours. Doyle said. "I'm accompanying the cargo." The contract said single crew. "I'm not crew, I'm the cargo manifest." She handed him the tablet. The manifest was 3 pages long and said essentially nothing. Equipment transfer, biological research material, proprietary, not subject to customs inspection under CIDA charter. Any questions? Rourke had approximately 40 questions. He asked none of them. He took the tablet, signed where indicated, and showed Voss to the crew bunk he'd cleared out, which still smelled like the coolant and the recycled air, and 11 years of his and Doyle's particular variety of bad decisions. She didn't say anything about the smell. That was either professionalism or desperation, and at this point Rourke wasn't sure which he was counting on. They undocked from Driscoll on schedule. The moon fell away behind them. The earth appeared ahead, brown and gray where it used to be blue, the permanent cloud shelf sitting at its equator like a scar that had stopped trying to heal. Rourke flew the approach arc on manual. He always flew manual when he was unsettled, because the specific physical demands of manual flight left less room in his head for the other things, and watched the earth turn, and thought about the retirement fund and the joint calcification, and the 12 years left on the lease and the 10 times payment, and the case that Voss had stowed in the bunk beside the cargo hold, without letting go of it even during boarding. 6 hours out of Driscoll, crate 9 Delta made a sound. Rourke was at the navigation console. Doyle was in the co-pilot's cradle eating something from a foil pouch that smelled aggressively of reconstituted meat. They both heard it. They looked at each other. It was not the sound of settling cargo, or the tick of temperature differential, or the groan of the synchronized structural members doing what old structural members did in the cold between stations. It was lower than any of those things. It had rhythm. It had the specific quality of something that was trying to communicate and hadn't found the right channel yet. Voss appeared in the corridor doorway. She had the case in her hand. "You heard it," Rourke said. "It's normal," she said. "What's normal about it?" Her jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters, which was the most he'd seen her face do anything. "It's biological material. It has biological cycles. It's normal." "Biological material that cycles," Doyle said, "doesn't usually make that sound." Rourke stood up. "I'm going to look at it." "That's not in the contract." "The contract says I'm responsible for the safety of all cargo on my vessel. I can't verify safety without inspection." He watched her face. She knew the contract. She'd written the contract. They both knew what it said. "Ms. Voss." Another 2 millimeters of jaw. Then, "Fine, but I come with you." The cargo hold was cold. Crate 9 Delta was at the far end, secured with 4 maglocks and what looked like an additional manual brace that had been added after loading, not standard configuration. The kind of thing you added if you were worried about the cargo getting out rather than worried about the cargo shifting in transit. The crate was large. Larger than you'd need for biological research material. If by biological research material you meant samples or cultures or anything that fit the usual definition of those words. Rourke stopped in front of it. He looked at the size of it. He looked at the manual brace. He looked at the 4 maglocks, each with a Voss Corporation seal rather than a standard CIDA one, meaning she'd applied them herself after loading. He looked at the small ventilation port at the top of the crate, which was running. "Biological research material doesn't need ventilation," he said. Voss said nothing. "There's a living thing in this crate," Rourke said. "Still nothing." "Who is it?" he said. "Or what is it?" He heard Voss exhale behind him, one long, controlled breath, the kind that precedes either a lie or a confession. What came out was something in between. "It's not human," she said. "It's not anything from this system. CIDA's extraction team found the vessel 14 months ago outside the development corridor. The vessel was drifting. The team, not all of them, came back, but they got the cargo out." "They got a living creature out," Rourke said. "A living creature they put in a crate. The directive was to secure and transport. The research station at Platform 14 has the facilities to." "To what?" "Study it." He turned. She was standing 3 feet back, the case in her hand, her carefully neutral face doing something it apparently hadn't been built to do, something that looked uncomfortable. "You've been carrying this for how long? How long has it been in that crate?" 11 days. 11 days. He turned back to the crate. He put his hand on the side of it, the way you put your hand on the side of a wall to feel if there was heat behind it. The crate was warm, not from the cargo hold's climate system, warm in the specific way of proximity to something living, something generating its own heat. He felt it through his palm and thought, absurdly, of the sceneridized smell, the way he knew the ship, the way you know a thing you've been close to for a very long time. He found the manual release. He looked back at Doyle, who had followed them in and was standing just inside the hold door with the specific expression of a man who has done enough bad runs to know when something has gone past the point of profitable ignorance. "Rourke," Doyle said. "I know," Rourke said. "It could be. I know what it could be. The contract." Doyle. He looked at his partner, his crewmate, the man he'd been assigned to at activation and chosen to stay with at every subsequent contract renewal, the man who had pulled him out of a coolant rupture at Europa Waypoint, and whose flask of terrible whiskey he had shared approximately 800 times in 11 years of the same terrible sky. "If there's something living in here, it's been in here for 11 days. That's the whole thing. That's the whole of it." Doyle looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the small, precise nod of a man who has made his calculation and is at peace with the result. Rourke released the crate. She was not what he expected, which was a thought so inadequate to the reality of her that he stood very still for nearly 10 seconds just processing the fact of her existence. She was tall, nearly 3 meters when fully upright, which she wasn't, not yet, folded into the crate's space with a patience that her posture communicated as chosen rather than imposed, a waiting rather than a cringing. Her form was bilateral but not remotely human. 4 limbs on the upper section, the primary pair long and articulated with too many joints, the secondary pair shorter, and held close against her torso in what would later become recognizable to Rourke as a gesture of careful non-aggression. Her surface was not skin the way he understood skin. It was something between hide and shell, deep iridescent black, rippling through violet and green as the hold's light caught it at different angles, like a deep-water creature hauled briefly into air. Her face had structure, 2 large forward-facing eyes with irises that were gold and amber and lit from within, a jaw adapted for a mouth that made different shapes than human speech required, features that had their own grammar, their own emotional register, entirely unlike his and entirely legible despite that. She was looking at him, not at the space where he was standing. At him, specifically his eyes, his hands on the crate door, the way he was standing. She was reading him the way you read something you have been hoping for and are cautious about hoping too much. Rourke realized he'd been holding his breath. He let it out slowly. "Hello," he said, which was not adequate but was what he had. She made a sound. It was not laryngeal the way his voice was laryngeal. It came from deeper, from something thoracic, resonant in a frequency that he felt more in his chest and his back molars than in his ears. It had structure. It had the unmistakable architecture of language, of intentional communication, of someone who had decided to speak. He didn't understand any of it, but he understood the shape. She was telling him she was there. She was telling him she was real. He stepped back just slightly, giving her room, and she unfolded. Slowly, the way you move when you've been in a small space for a long time and you're not certain yet of the space you're moving into. She came to her full height and the top of her head was 4 inches from the hold ceiling. She looked at the hold. She looked at Voss, who had gone very still. She looked at Doyle, who had the expression of a man whose capacity for astonishment has been reached and is now operating in some quieter register beyond it. And then she looked back at Rourke. Her eyes dropped to his hands. He had cuts on both hands, old ones. A new one from the cargo clamp at Driscoll that had been stiff. The accumulated small damages of 19 years of working ships that were always slightly too old, and equipment that was always slightly too neglected. He had a burn scar on his left forearm, long and pale, from the Europa rupture. He had a place on his right side where 3 of his ribs had been broken and had healed wrong because he hadn't reported it. A Helix supervisor at Callisto Station, 5 years ago, who had decided that a 3rd gen making a formal safety complaint needed to be educated about the appropriate expectations of contract labor. He had not reported the ribs. He had gone back to work the next rotation. She reached out her secondary right hand, 4 fingers, longer than his, jointed differently, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone offering something rather than taking something, and touched the back of his scarred hand very lightly. Just the fingertips, just a contact. The sound she made then was different. Not the structured resonance of speech. Something more immediate, more direct, coming from a place below whatever she used for language. He felt it in his sternum. He felt it in the heel-drawn ribs. He felt it in the dream he'd had twice in the past year that he hadn't told Doyle about. The dream of a green hillside and cold mist, and a language in the air that wasn't English and wasn't any language he'd been loaded with at activation, and that he knew anyway in the dream, the way you know things you've never been taught. The sound asked a question that his brain assembled before his ears caught up with it. Who did this to you? He stood very still. The hold was cold, and the ship smelled like bad decisions, and there was a creature from somewhere past the edge of charted space touching his scarred hand, and asking him a question that 19 years of being 3rd gen expendable cargo labor had trained him to regard as unanswerable. There's a lot of answers to that, he said. The sound deepened. It wanted to hear them. Not now, he said. Not, he stopped. Looked at Voss. She was still holding her case, still wearing her carefully neutral face, but something had changed in her eyes, something that looked like the specific expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for 11 days and has just watched someone else pick it up. What does CIDA want with her? Rourke said. Voss said, you've already violated the contract. There's no version of this where. Voss, he kept his voice level, what does CIDA want with her? The jaw 2 millimeters. The vessel she came from was not alone. When the extraction team found it, there were signals, consistent with communication, consistent with a fleet. Somewhere past the corridor, CIDA believes she's an advance representative, an envoy, she paused. They want to know what she knows, what she was sent to communicate. They want to, another pause, study the methodology. They want to interrogate her, Doyle said from the doorway. That's not the terminology. It's the word, Rourke said. He looked at the alien queen. She was still watching him, her hand still resting lightly on his, and the resonance she was generating was low and steady, the frequency of attention, of someone listening to a conversation about themselves with the patience of someone who has been in a crate for 11 days and has had time to develop extensive patience. She came here to make contact, he said. She was sent. Her people sent her to find us, and CIDA grabbed her before she could say anything. CIDA found an unprecedented asset. She's not an asset, Rourke said. His voice was still level. He was quite proud of how level it was. She is a person. She came here on behalf of her civilization to introduce themselves to ours, and your people locked her in a crate. He looked at Voss. How long until Platform 14? 18 hours. Not anymore, Rourke said. Doyle, pull up the Kepler relay network. Old infrastructure, pre-corporate. There's a deep-range array at L4 that hasn't been decommissioned. It was just switched off during the budget consolidation. Doyle was already at the Hold's secondary terminal. I know the one. Signal strength is going to be minimal. We'd need to boost the gain, probably cannibalize the secondary comms array. Can you do it? Doyle looked at the terminal, looked at the alien queen. Looked at his own hands, which were scarred in the same places as Rourke's, because they'd been made in the same facility, assigned to the same ships, subjected to the same equipment and the same supervisors and the same indifferent arithmetic of the Helix Corporation's labor model. Yeah, he said. I can do it. Voss, Rourke said, you have a translation scaffold in that case. She looked at him sharply. The case you've been carrying since Driscoll. You don't carry monitoring equipment in a case that size unless you're also carrying something that runs monitoring equipment. And CIDA wouldn't send someone to accompany a biological research asset without a communication framework, even a preliminary one. You have a scaffold. I need it. She was quiet for a long moment. The Hold hummed around them. The alien queen's resonance had changed slightly. It was reading the room now, Rourke felt, reading the tension and the specifics of what was being negotiated. If I give it to you, Voss said, and this works, whatever this is, CIDA will consider me complicit. You were complicit the moment you agreed to take the job, Rourke said, not unkindly. That's not an accusation. I agreed to take the job too. We both already made our choice. We just made it in ignorance. He paused. Now we know. What we do now, that's the choice that matters. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He was not a man who tried to project anything in moments like this, not authority, not righteousness, not certainty. Just the specific quality of someone who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it, which was, he had found over 19 years, the most persuasive thing a person could project. Voss set the case down. She opened it. The translation scaffold was a cluster of hardware and a software system that had been designed by CIDA's research division over 18 months based on the signal data recovered before the extraction team's feed cut out. It was not a full translator. It was more like a listening device for a kind of music you'd never heard before. It couldn't produce meaning from the resonances, not yet, but it could capture them, map their architecture, identify recurring patterns, and begin the work of building a framework that both sides of the conversation could operate inside. Voss explained this with the precise language of someone who had been briefed extensively on a technology she hadn't developed, which was different from understanding it, which was different from believing in it, which was where Rourke needed her to be. She doesn't need it to send, Rourke said. She needs it to be received, on the other end. When the signal gets out. You think her people are listening. I think her people sent her into unknown territory as an envoy, and when she didn't come back they kept listening. I think they've been listening for 11 days. He looked at the alien queen. Yes. The resonance confirmed it. Low, certain, with something underneath it that his chest translated as they are close, not distance exactly, but proximity in some sense that space and time together described. They have been waiting. Then we need to hurry, Rourke said. What followed was 8 hours of the kind of work that looked like chaos from outside, and was, from inside, a very specific kind of ordered desperation. Doyle worked the comms array with the focused precision he brought to all engineering problems, which was something between a surgeon's care and a man settling a personal grudge. He narrated pieces of it to Rourke in the staccato shorthand of 11 years of side-by-side work, and Rourke fetched components and held connections, and ran power checks, and kept the Sceneride's aging electrical system from killing the whole project through the application of everything he knew about the specific ways old ships failed. Voss set up the scaffold. She worked quietly, with the efficiency of someone who has decided which side of a door they're going to be on and is getting on with it. Occasionally she would turn to the alien queen, who had come fully out of the hold and was now in the main cabin, folded into a space that was too small for her but bearable, watching everything with those amber gold eyes, and explain what the scaffold was trying to do, in the kind of careful, measured language you use when you're not sure how much is being understood but are certain some of it is. The alien queen listened to all of it with the patient gravity of something that had been in a crate for 11 days, and had had time to develop its understanding of what human competence looked like and how long to give it. At hour 6, something happened that none of them were prepared for. Rourke was running cable from the secondary array junction to Doyle's rebuilt transmitter when the alien queen came to stand beside him. Not close. She was careful about proximity, careful about presence, taking up space with a consideration that he recognized as deliberate, the behavior of something that understood its own size and chose not to use it as pressure. She stood beside him and watched him work for a moment, and then she made a sound. Not the resonance. Something smaller, more directed, aimed at the specific frequency of him, his ears, his attention, the particular channel between two people rather than the broadcast of a language. He stopped what he was doing. She crouched, a significant gesture from something her size, bringing her face to roughly his level, which felt like a choice rather than a convenience. Her eyes found his. She reached out her secondary hand, the same hand as before, and this time she didn't touch his hand. She touched his forearm, the burn scar, tracing the length of it with one fingertip, very slowly, very deliberately. Not probing, not examining. Something more like acknowledging, the gesture of someone who reads a scar the way you read a sentence, who understands that a mark left on a body is a record of what that body survived. Then her hand moved to his side, to the place where the ribs had healed wrong, and she didn't touch it, just held her hand near it, close enough that he felt the warmth of her, and the resonance she made was quieter than anything he'd heard from her, the intimate register, the one that didn't need an audience. His brain assembled it before his ears understood it. Who did this to you? He'd been asked before, by station medics who had to document injuries in the system and were careful not to put the real answers in the record. By Doyle twice, who had phrased it as "you need to go get that looked at," and had not pushed when Rourke had said "I already did." He'd never answered it honestly. There was no point in answering it honestly when the people doing the asking were employees of the same company whose supervisors had caused the injuries. And there was no point in answering it honestly when the people doing the asking were your only family, and the answer would make them feel helpless. But she was neither of those things. She was something from outside the entire system that had made the injuries. She was something that had no stake in the answer except the answer. He told her. Not all of it, there wasn't time, and she didn't have the scaffold running yet, and he wasn't even sure how much she was catching in terms of specific language rather than emotional content. But he told her the shape of it, the contract, the way the math worked on third-gen labor. The retirement fund that wasn't a fund, the Callisto supervisor and the ribs and the reason he hadn't reported it, the 19 years of looking the other way because looking away was how you survived, and the 11 years of his and Doyle's particular survival together, the bad whiskey and the Sceneride's bad smell, and the specific comfort of a ship that was always breaking because it was yours. It was at least that. She listened to all of it with absolute stillness, and when he finished, the resonance that came out of her was the longest one he'd heard, structured, layered, dimensional in a way the scaffold would later reveal to have been a formal register, the kind of language you used for official statements, for records, for things intended to be carried forward. He didn't understand the words, he understood the weight. He would not learn until much later, from the translated transcript, what she had said in full. The rough equivalent, the closest the scaffold's translation engine could render it into something humans could hold. I see what was done to you. I see what was done to the one beside you. I see what system made these wounds and why. It will not be unnamed. Those who built that system will answer for it before my people and yours together. This I speak as record. At the time, standing in the main cabin of a 20-year-old cargo ship with a rebuilt transmitter and a cold hold and 8 hours until Platform 14. He understood it in his chest and his heel-drawn ribs, and the dream of a green hillside and cold mist, where he knew a language he'd never been taught. It felt like a door that had been locked for 19 years, swinging open on its hinges. Doyle finished the array at hour 8. He came out of the cable junction with grease on both forearms and the particular glow of a man who has done something technically impossible and is modest about it in the way of people who have nothing to prove. "It'll push a signal," he said. "Can't guarantee reception at this range. Can't guarantee." "It'll be enough," Rourke said. "How do you know?" He looked at the alien queen. She had her primary arms raised slightly, the upper limbs spread in a posture he'd come to recognize over 8 hours as attention, full, directed attention, the posture of listening to something that wasn't in the room yet. She was already receiving something, some frequency below what their array was even operating on yet, was already in her range. "Because they're already listening," he said. She went to the transmitter. What happened in the next 14 minutes was the closest thing to a miracle that Rourke had ever been inside of. Not the fireworks kind. The quiet kind. The kind that happened in kitchens and cargo holds and the cramped workshops of people who had improvised their way to something that mattered. She placed her primary hands on the transmitter housing and she spoke. Not in the close, intimate register she'd used with Rourke. Not in the formal record register she'd used after looking at his scars, but in something older and larger, the full-dimensional resonance of her species' communication, layered in frequencies the scaffold captured, and rendered in waveforms that Voss described, quietly, as the most complex signal architecture she had ever seen from any source, human or otherwise. It ran for 14 minutes, then she stopped, and her hands came down and she turned to the room. The Sci-Fi's proximity alarm went off 9 minutes later. Not Platform 14, not CIDA, not Helix Corporation Security, though Rourke had been doing math on that one. The contact profile was nothing in any register he had. The scanner was showing something at 600,000 kilometers, and closing, not fast, not slow, with the specific deliberate pacing of something that knows where it's going and is making sure you have time to see it coming. 7 vessels, not small. "Oh," said Doyle very quietly. They came out of the dark the way the dark releases things that have been inside it. Not erupting, not arriving dramatically, but becoming visible, the way stars become visible as your eyes adjust, one by one until you can't remember not seeing them. They were organic in silhouette, not mechanical the way human ships were mechanical, not angular and functional, but built with the logic of living things, of things that had grown rather than been assembled, cathedrals of a biology that had learned to move through space without abandoning the forms that evolution had given it. The largest one came toward the Sci-Fi. Rourke looked at the alien queen. She was watching the viewport with an expression he'd learned in 8 hours to read, not perfectly but well enough. It was relief and recognition, and the specific warmth of being in the presence of something you had feared you might not see again. Her secondary hands were pressed together in front of her in a gesture that felt private, that felt like something you would look away from. He looked away. The platform alarm lit up. Not an emergency, a docking request. From the largest alien vessel. Translated through a protocol that should not have existed, that had not existed 9 minutes ago, that the scaffold was now running with a fluency that implied it had been waiting for exactly this kind of signal to learn from. The request said, in approximate translation, We have been waiting. We would like to come aboard. Rurg pressed accept. The docking took 15 minutes and was the smoothest docking in his 19-year career. They didn't use the Stories clamps. The alien vessel extended something that was both structural and biological, a connection point that integrated with the Stories airlock with a precision that suggested the alien engineers had studied human ship design extensively, probably from the vessel their extraction team had boarded 14 months ago and had adapted accordingly. The airlock opened on its own, and the air that came through was different from ship air, denser, warmer, carrying a smell like rain on hot stone and something else, something that the back of Rourke's brain identified as home before his conscious mind had processed anything. Two of them came through. Taller than the Queen slightly, wearing something that was either clothing or a structural extension of themselves. Rourke couldn't be sure, and it didn't matter. They came through and they went directly to her, and there was a resonance exchange that lasted 4 minutes and that the scaffold could not fully translate because it was too dense, too layered, too much happening at once. But the emotional content was visible in every posture, in the way she held herself, in the way they moved around her. She was telling them. She was telling them all of it. Then one of them turned to Rourke. The resonance was in the formal register, the official record register, the one that carried weight. The scaffold rendered it in a single pass. You opened the place she was held. You heard her. You built what was needed. These things are recorded. Rourke said she was locked up. That's not something I could leave. The resonance came back, and it wasn't formal anymore. It was something quieter, more direct, something that landed in the same place as the alien Queen's voice after she'd read his scars. He let it settle before he tried to understand it. When it resolved, what it said was, "We know what you are among your kind. We know what it cost you to be it. We have a word for this. We have always had a word for it. We have been looking for it among your people for a very long time." Rourke glanced at Doyle. Doyle had the look he always had when something had exceeded the envelope of what he'd prepared to deal with, which was a very specific controlled blankness that Rourke had learned to translate as deep processing. He looked at Voss, who was standing with her hands at her sides and her face doing something new, something that had gotten past the careful neutrality, something that looked like what happened when a person who has spent years working for the wrong side of a line suddenly finds themselves on the right side of it and doesn't yet know what to do with the geography. The alien Queen crossed to Rourke. She stood before him, and she reached out both secondary hands, and she held his damaged hands in hers, and she made the resonance that the scaffold would later translate as the formal version of everything she'd said to him in the private register, the records register, the version that was meant to be carried forward into whatever history was about to be written. Every wound you carry, I see them. Every wound on the one beside you, I see those too. The system that made them will be named before both our peoples. The ones who built it will answer. This is not a comfort I offer. This is a fact I speak. You will see it happen. He stood in the cramped main cabin of the Stories, which smelled like bad decisions and 19 years of survival, and he held the hands of something that had come across the dark to find his species, and had instead been put in a crate, and he felt the dream of the green hillside settle into him, the way things settle when they stop being dreams and start being real. "Okay," he said. He said it very quietly. He said it the way you say a thing when you have been waiting for it for 19 years and you didn't know you were waiting, but your body knew, your heel-drawn ribs knew, your scarred hands knew, the accumulated damage of a life spent at the bottom of someone else's system knew. Okay. The 6 other alien vessels had positioned themselves between the Stories and Platform 14. This was not threatening. They weren't blocking the approach with any kind of aggression. They were positioned the way a wall is positioned, the specific geometry of something that says this is a boundary, and what is on the other side of it does not get to come here yet, not until the negotiation has happened, not until the record has been spoken. CIDA's response was logged at platform 14 72 minutes later, a transmission on standard frequencies that the Stories comms received, requesting status update, requesting cargo status, using the specific language of an organization that had not yet processed the fact that there was nothing to request. Voss drafted the reply. She did it in the official register, in the language of the contract she'd handed Rourke at Driscoll, and what it said was, in essence, the cargo is an envoy of a spacefaring civilization and has made contact with her people, and the terms of this operation are no longer operative. If you would like to discuss the formal contact protocols, the alien fleet is prepared to receive communications through the scaffold array currently operating on this vessel. If you would like to discuss the 11 days the envoy spent in a crate, please retain legal counsel. She sent it without asking Rourke for approval. He told her it was good. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been in the wrong room for a very long time and has just found the door. "Where do we go from here?" she said. "Don't know," he said, "but we go." The 3 days that followed were documented extensively in the Contact Commission's records and barely at all in Rourke's memory, which was not because he wasn't paying attention, but because certain things exceed the capacity of memory to hold their own shape and become instead a feeling, a quality of air, a sense that persists longer than the specific events that caused it. What he remembered clearly was specific and small. Doyle rebuilding the scaffold array 3 times over to improve its resolution, narrating each step to the alien engineers who had come aboard and who turned out to have opinions about cable routing. Voss translating back and forth between the Governance Council representatives who began arriving at day 2, their formal suits at odds with the Stories' specific kind of lived-in chaos. The alien queen at the viewport, watching the Earth the way you watch something that you have come a long way to see and are still processing the reality of. He remembered one moment with particular sharpness. It was late on the second day. The Governance Council representatives had retired to Platform 14 to compose a formal response. The alien crew had returned to their vessel for a cycle he understood as rest. The scaffold was quiet. The Stories held just Rourke and Doyle and Voss and the alien queen, the specific middle-of-the-night quiet of a ship between things. The alien queen came to sit, or the closest approximation of sitting that her anatomy allowed, near the forward viewport. She looked at the Earth for a long time. Then she looked at Rourke and made a sound that was not in the formal register, not in the official record register, but in the private one, the one she'd used when she was reading his scars. The scaffold was running low-grade. It caught the edges of it. What it rendered was rough. I did not know before I came here what I would find. I knew what my people sent me to say. I did not know what I would find in the ones who heard it first. She paused in her resonance, the pause of someone choosing their words carefully in a language they are still learning to speak through a machine. You were not what I expected. You were better. Rourke looked at his hands, at the scars and the cuts and the burn, and the place where the ribs had healed wrong. At 19 years of cargo runs and bad dockings and subpar retirement projections, and the specific arithmetic of being expendable. "We were looking the other way," he said, "for a long time." The resonance said, "I know, and then you stopped." "Yeah," he said, "then we stopped." Doyle appeared with 2 mugs of coffee, the good kind, the last of the good kind, which Voss had turned out to be carrying in her personal kit, and had shared without ceremony on the first night, the way certain people shared things when the situation had gotten large enough that personal kit no longer seemed like a relevant category. He handed one to Rourke, looked at the alien queen, then turned and got a 3rd mug and brought it back and set it on the console near her in the gesture of someone who understands that the gesture matters even if the object doesn't translate. She looked at the mug. She looked at Doyle. She made a sound that the scaffold rendered as something in between gratitude and amusement, and something else that didn't have a human word, The feeling of being included in a small, ordinary thing when you have been outside of ordinary things for 11 days. Doyle sat down. They drank their coffee. The earth turned in the viewport, brown and gray, its permanent scar of cloud going slowly pink at the edge where the sun was finding it. The atmospheric work, Rourke said, her people. The remediation technology, the contact commission mentioned. 3 generations, Doyle said. That's what the translated brief said. They can do it in 3 human generations. Rourke looked at the earth. He thought about the dream of the hillside, the wet green grass, the cold mist, the language in the air that his body knew before his mind did. He thought about what it would mean for that to be real, not a dream loaded into him at activation, not a copy of someone else's memory, but something his own body had been carrying forward on its own, through all the coolant ruptures and the bad dockings and the heel-drawn ribs, the specific stubbornness of a body that has been told it is 3rd generation and expendable, and has continued anyway to know a hillside it has never stood on. We won't see it, he said. We'll be gone before it's done. Yeah, Doyle said. But it'll happen. Yeah, Doyle said again, the same precise way. The geological certainty of a man who has looked at a problem and run the numbers and is willing to stand behind the result. Rourke raised his mug. Doyle raised his. On the console near the alien queen, her mug sat untouched and included. He drank his coffee and watched the earth turn pink at the edge. In the months that came after, Rourke gave testimony to 4 separate governance bodies, 2 contact commissions, and 1 independent journalist who was writing about the clone labor reclassification and wanted to understand, she said, what it had felt like to be the person who opened the crate. He gave it honestly because the alien queen had asked him to be honest, and because the record was, as she had said in the formal register, the thing that carried the weight forward. What he told them was simple. He hadn't been a hero. He hadn't calculated. He had walked into a cargo hold and found a door that was locked when it shouldn't have been, and he had opened it, and everything else had followed from that. The question he'd been asked his whole life, how do you survive at the bottom of a system that considers you expendable, he'd been answering wrong. He'd been answering, keep your head down, look the other way, count your luck and add it up against the risk. The right answer was, you open the doors, you open every door that shouldn't be locked. You do it without knowing what's behind it. You do it because the lock is the problem, not the mystery. The alien queen's formal testimony to the First Contact Commission was translated by the scaffold over 3 sessions and rendered in a document that ran to 60 pages in the human record. The section that Rourke read most was a short paragraph near the middle, the one that had been given in the private register rather than the formal one, the one that the translators had flagged as personal communication embedded within the official record. A thing her people apparently did, threading private speech through public statement as a way of making the record whole. It said, in the closest English approximation, I have traveled far to speak to this species. I have seen what they have done to themselves and to each other, and I have seen what they have made of the ones they created and called less than. I have also seen 2 of those less than ones open a locked crate in a cold cargo hold and decide, without argument or calculation, that a living thing should not be in it. I have seen one of them hold out his scarred hands to me as if they were not scarred. I have seen the other one bring me coffee. These things are in the record. I want them in the record. Because a species is not its worst acts. A species is also this, 2 tired people at the end of a bad run, past the edge of what their contract allows, choosing to open the door anyway. That is also what they are. It is, perhaps, mostly what they are. Rourke read it once, and then a second time, and then he put it down. He was on the western coast of Ireland by then, the dormant base that the First Contact protocols had established, partly because the western coast had the best remaining uncontaminated ground and partly, he suspected, because the alien queen had learned his dream and understood something about the relationship between a body and a place it had always known. Doyle had a bunk across the hall. Voss was running the scaffold translation team out of the main facility, having been rehired at a significantly improved rate under the new governance structure. CIDA had been dissolved, its assets seized, its directors under indictment in 11 jurisdictions, the full weight of its 40-year record of treating its workers as cargo bearing down on it through every legal mechanism that the contact protocols had, in their first formal act, insisted on establishing. It was cold outside. It was wet. The grass was the specific deep green that happened when rain hit good soil, the kind of green that had no equivalent indoors, no manufactured approximation, no file memory loaded at activation that was adequate to the real thing. Rourke went out and stood in it. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. The scars were there still, all of them, the cuts and the burn and the heel-drawn ribs pressing against his jacket with every breath. They would always be there. He understood now that they were supposed to be, that they were the record of the specific friction of the specific life, that they were the reason he'd been standing in the cold cargo hold at the right moment with the right nothing left to lose to open a locked crate. The alien queen was somewhere in the dark above him. Not visible, not tonight. Her vessel was in the far orbit, holding position as the contact protocols worked their slow formal way through the bodies of both civilizations. But she was there. He could feel it the way he felt the resonance in his chest, the frequency below hearing where certain things lived that were true whether or not you had a word for them. She had said, "I see every wound. Those who made them will answer." She had meant it. He had watched it happen, the indictments, the reclassifications, the 400,000-person audit of the clone labor program, the specific faces of the people who had built the system standing in the light of what the system had done and finding no place left to stand. It was not finished. It would not be finished for years, but it was moving with the patient certainty of something that has been decided at a level where decisions hold. He breathed in the cold air and felt the wet grass under his boots and heard, in the wind that came off the Atlantic and across the dark field, a sound that his body knew before his mind did. It was the dream language, the one that had been in him since before he could remember, since before he was activated, since before the facility in Cologne and the Helix contract, and the Scenridai and 19 years of looking the other way. It had been there all along in the place where things lived that were true regardless. He was standing in the field. He was exactly the size he was. It was enough. The Governance Commission held its first open session 6 months after first contact. Rourke sat in the third row of the gallery in a building in Dublin that had been opened for the purpose, knew enough that it still smelled of plaster and fresh timber, and watched representatives of 11 surviving nations and 4 orbital jurisdictions take their seats around a table that had been specifically designed to accommodate the alien delegation's physical dimensions. The alien queen was not present. She had returned to her people's fleet to carry the contact record home, which was what an envoy did when the mission was complete. But 3 of her people were present, seated with the specific patient gravity that he'd come to understand as their resting state, the natural posture of a civilization that had been practicing patience for a very long time. He watched the session open. He watched the formal acknowledgments made. He watched the point in the proceedings where the Contact Commission's chair read aloud the section of the alien queen's testimony that described the cargo hold, the locked crate, the 2 third-generation clone workers and their decision. He watched the commission chair stumble slightly over the word third generation, the specific catch of someone encountering the word in a context that forced them to understand it differently, to feel the weight of it rather than simply read it. Doyle was in the 4th row, directly behind him. He leaned forward at that moment and said very quietly into the back of Rourke's head, "There we are." Rourke said nothing. He watched. He had been asked at several of the testimony sessions whether he felt that history would remember what he and Doyle had done, whether the record would carry it forward accurately, whether the commission would get the details right. He had given honest answers. He didn't know, he wasn't sure, he wasn't counting on it. Records had a way of gravitating toward the large and the official and the photographable, away from the cold cargo hold and the bad smell and the specific courage of two tired men at the end of a bad run. But the alien queen had put it in the record herself, in the formal register and the private one both. She had said, "I want them in the record." And she was something that understood what a record meant, what it was for, what it carried forward across the dark between meetings. Her people's records ran for millennia. They knew how to make sure the thing that mattered was the thing that lasted. The commission session ran for 4 hours. It addressed, in formal terms, the initial contact protocols, the remediation timeline, the trade framework, the reclassification of all Helix and CIDA contract workers under the new governance structure. It addressed the establishment of the translation scaffold network. It addressed the question of what a first meeting between two civilizations was supposed to look like and established, with the specific careful language of law, that it was supposed to look like something other than a crate. At the break, Rourke went outside. Dublin was cold, overcast, the sky the particular flat gray of a city that had been breathing bad air for 30 years and was just beginning slowly to breathe better. He stood on the steps and looked at it. Doyle came out and stood beside him. He had the flask, the old dented tin one, the terrible whiskey, and he held it out without looking. Rourke took it, he drank. The whiskey was bad. It had always been bad. It would probably always be bad. The consistency of it was its own kind of comfort, the specific comfort of things that were reliably themselves. "You think she made it home?" Doyle said. "Yeah," Rourke said, "I think so." "Think they'll come back?" Rourke looked at the gray sky. At the edge of it, where the clouds thinned, there was a strip of blue, not much, not the blue the sky used to be, but something, a beginning. "The remediation program," he said. 3 generations, someone has to run it. "Someone from their side," Doyle said. "Yeah. So they'll be back in 3 weeks." "Something like that." Doyle took the flask back. They stood in the cold together and watched the strip of blue at the edge of the gray. "Not bad," Doyle said, "for a bad run." Rourke thought about the sceneridized smell, the bolt count, the co-pilot's cradle and the knee that ground when he stood up, and the lease with 12 years left. He thought about the cargo hold and the warm side of the crate and the first sound she had made, the resonance below hearing that his chest had caught before his ears did. He thought about her hands on his scarred hands and the thing she had said in the private register, the one that the scaffold had caught just enough of to give him the shape of it. "Who did this to you?" He had answered. He had finally answered, honestly, the way the question deserved. And what had come back was not sympathy, not the careful, soft sorry of someone who couldn't change anything. What had come back was the formal register, the record register, the weight of a civilization behind every word. They will answer for it. They were. It was happening. The gray sky above Dublin held its strip of blue. Rourke stood in it and breathed the cold air and let his scarred hands rest in his jacket pockets and thought. I opened the door. That was the whole of it. That was always going to be the whole of it.